morning, everybody. My name is Kanatase Horn, and I'm Mohawk from Ganawage, but also from Gasadage through my mother. I currently live here in the Ottawa area, just on the other side of the river, with my partner and our 4-year-old son. So it's nice to see a child here. I unfortunately couldn't bring my son here. I was busy finishing my paper, and so I had to drop my son off with my mom. And so this was a sort of a collaborative paper or presentation. Last night, as I was cleaning up this paper, I had my girlfriend create a slideshow for you guys. So feel free to watch and listen at the same time and get a feel of the land and the water that I'm talking about. And with that being said, I just want to say I'm thankful for the Algonquin people for me to be here. It's very important to mention that, considering the topic that or the things that I'm talking about. So I'll just get to my paper then. In January 2016, in the Globe and Mail article titled "Land Rights City Building at Odds in Ottawa's Zibi Project," author Alex Bezakovich wrote a surprisingly nuanced yet cautious piece describing the evolving status of the Zibi Project, which is a development project situated just outside of downtown Ottawa. Interestingly, Bezakovich described the project in conflicting terms, suggesting the developers were attempting to construct a one-of-a-kind, sustainable, green, mixed residence shopping complex, complete with condos, shops, and cafes, along the picturesque Chaudière Falls, while also pointing towards the end of his article, that the project is going to be built on top of sacred lands that were dispossessed from the Anishinaabe people. For a conservative paper like the Globe and Mail to publish this kind of nuanced article is noteworthy. In my opinion, however, rather than simply reflecting an attempt to provide a balanced journalistic take on the Zibi project, I believe his article and the conflicting descriptions that he provides actually reflects a broader anxiety about property rights in Canada. That is, Bezakovich's article unintentionally describes the unsettledness of property in Canada. As geographer Nicholas Blomley reminds us, property, and specifically private property, is far from being a settled and stable legal right. Instead, as a settler colonial nation that was formed through violent dispossessions which operated in conjunction with policies of Indigenous containment and erasure, property in Canada will always remain an unstable, fractured, and unsettled right. So in light of framing property in this way, my paper will seek to demonstrate how the Zibi project is exemplary of settler colonialism's materiality, but specifically its spatial logic. In the rest of this paper, I want to explore how the Zibi project reproduces settler colonial property relations, in that the project must suppress Anishinaabe sovereignty in order to alleviate the supposed housing needs of a growing urban population. With that in mind, the purpose of this paper is not for me to take a position on the ongoing debate whether it is wrong to build condos and shopping plazas on sacred sites. For I am Mohawk, I'm a guest on this land, and this is not my role in this conversation. Instead, my paper seeks to expose the material and discursive practices that have created the conditions for development to take place in the first place. Through this process is my intention to demonstrate the unstable nature of property, which can hopefully produce new ways of thinking about property, and more importantly, reframe property relations in a way that respects Anishinaabe sovereignty and Indigenous sovereignty more generally. So I've titled this subsection of my paper, quote unquote, "The Reproduction of Property," since it reflects a growing scholarly trend that emphasizes or stresses the so-called social construction or constitution of property. Inspired by post-structural and post-colonial thought, scholars like Eva Mackey and Nicholas Blomley emphasize that far from being a universal truth or something that exists outside of ourself or outside of social relationships, property, specifically private property, is the consequence and materialization of personal and collective investments, processes, and actions that seek to create a world in light of particular understandings of human nature, our relationships to others, to land, and to nature. So in a capitalist and increasingly neoliberal society like Canada, this means land is understood as a resource, a commodity that can be bought and sold in a free market. Although legal actors would define this as the buying and selling of property rights. So we're not buying and selling things, we're buying and selling rights to things, which reflects the legal definition of property being a bundle of rights. So the right to enjoy, to exclude, and the right to transfer to other people. Blomley refers to this as the ownership model. While he agrees this model has tremendous normative force in the world, especially in terms of shaping our understanding and expectations of citizenship and the rights that come along with citizenship, he also suggests that this model is fairly incomplete, in that it is too abstract, too impersonal, and misses how property is actually performed on the ground. Although I should note that Blomley uses the language of enacting property more so than he uses the language of performing. The idea of performing or enacting property represents an important intervention into our understanding of property, since it sheds light on the extra-legal forces that give property its force. That is, instead of being a universal truth, property requires embodied and material actions, institutions, and most importantly, discursive practices that exist outside of itself to give it power in the world. So in light of this more relational approach to property, Blomley and others argue that property is a lens in which to understand how subjectivities and relationships are formed and mediated. Stated another way, property, especially in urban centers, shapes how we see ourselves in the world. It mediates and guides our relationships with others, and frames our expectations as citizens. However, in settler colonial contexts, enacting or performing property takes on a new meaning beyond the idea of creating a social world on a blank spatial canvas. Indeed, enacting property in settler colonial contexts is also a project of displacement. It is a project of ignoring and suppressing Indigenous ontologies, epistemologies, geographies, and legal orders. Taken together, enacting property in settler colonial contexts is an ongoing project of creating a social world on top of a world that already existed. Thus, property is settler colonialism in action. As many have noted, this project has firm roots in John Locke's writing, especially his infamous Two Treatises of Government, where he claims that property is created when you mix your labor with the land. It's even better when you fence off that land, because you demonstrate to the world that this land is yours. You invested yourself into the land through your actions. According to Locke, however, simply fencing off your property is not enough. Indeed, you need the protection of, or property requires a central government to enforce your property rights against others. As many of you are probably well aware, Locke's political philosophy provided the foundation for the establishment of liberal forms of government, since it was argued that governments needed to protect your private property. With that in mind, I bring up Locke not to delve into a discussion of political philosophy and the justification for government, but instead I bring up Locke to briefly explore how this narrative of transforming the landscape as a foundation for property was foundational for colonialism and ongoing settler colonialism. As Jane Tully points out, Locke wrote the way he did and framed property as the result of mixing labor with the land, since Locke was interested in displacing Indigenous forms of property. While Locke recognized that Indigenous people existed, to him, the Indians did not improve the land. They did not fence it off. They did not have a recognizable government that could enforce an individual's property rights. For Locke, the Indians were truly savages and lived in a state of nature. Thus, they could not prevent settlers from establishing cities, governments, and nation states. Quite simply, they could not stand in the way of progress. But the Indians did have conceptions of property, and they did have governments. They had territories that they cared about and cared for, since the land gave them life and took care of them since time immemorial. Simply because Locke and other settlers could not, or rather would not, recognize Indigenous conceptions of property did not mean that Indigenous forms of property did not exist and continue to exist to this day. So to return to the idea of enacting property then, enacting property allows one to feel rooted, or as Eva Matthew puts it, certain in your property rights. At the same time, the presence of Indigenous people unsettles that certainty, meaning enacting property is also a form of suppressing Indigenous sovereignties. And because the settler colonial project is incomplete, because we are still here, enactments will always be and continue to be acts of displacement and erasure. So, while the previous discussion painted a rather bleak picture for Indigenous space or Indigenous claims to space, in that I might have come across that Indigenous space does not exist, the world is not as black and white as I just indicated. Indigenous people still have territories and communities to call our own. Of course, those are First Nations reserves, Inuit municipalities, and Métis settlements. The status of these communities have become entrenched in law, whether that be through royal decree, legislative enactment, a treaty right, or a land claim settlement. However, many think that these communities represent the extent of Indigenous land. That is, Indigenous claims to space must not extend beyond the borders of these communities. In fact, I would think many Canadians would feel that their property rights would be threatened if Indigenous people were to begin making claims beyond their borders of their legally recognized communities. This has indeed been the case in many parts of Canada, especially in British Columbia, where the concerns of property owners have been put at ease by the British Columbia government, where the concerns of property owners were taken seriously, and the government said that the BC treaty process will not undermine private property, which you can see from the fact that only 4% of provincial land in British Columbia was set aside for remedying the establishment of British Columbia. This is even the case in Ontario, with the ongoing Algonquins of Ontario comprehensive land claim for a huge chunk of Ontario, including the Ottawa area. The point that I'm trying to make is that even legitimate claims to land, based on historical grievances, cannot undermine property rights. Ultimately, Indigenous claims to land cannot unsettle what is assumed to be certain. They cannot unsettle the expectations of settlers who feel secure because they have invested so much into their property, whether that was through their money, their resources, or through their labor. Which brings me to the Zibi project. On first impression, the Zibi project's developers seem to be going about things in a fairly sensitive way, from using the Anishinaabeg word Zibi, meaning river, to name the development, to promising to hire local Indigenous people, to even consulting the Algonquins of Ontario, although I'm very well aware that this is very controversial. Zibi is even promising to clean up the ecological disaster that Hydro Ontario and Domtar left behind after over a century of industrial use. For many, these are reasons to celebrate Zibi, or at the bare minimum, not equate Zibi with other more nefarious developments that completely disregard Indigenous land claims. And to be fair, this is true. Zibi's developers are doing things differently. But that is not the point of this paper. Instead, it is to emphasize that Zibi, no matter how you look at it, continues to displace Anishinaabeg sovereignty. Zibi is complicit in the continued suppression of Anishinaabeg sovereignty by the very act of purchasing land from Domtar and the National Capital Commission in order to develop their mixed residence shopping complex. Simply put, Zibi's developers are investing their faith in the power of property. They are investing their faith in the certainty of property, which, as I've been trying to make clear throughout this paper, is only certain as long as Indigenous sovereignty is suppressed. Therefore, Zibi can promise to clean up the land. They can continue to consult with the Algonquins of Ontario. However, this does not change the fact that Anishinaabeg sovereignty is still being suppressed and displaced. So to conclude this paper, although it's beyond my role as an upcoming academic and as a Mohawk that is a guest here, to offer solutions to this particular manifestation of settler colonialism, it would be a fair comment to say that the sacredness of this area, the sacredness of the falls, the islands, that must guide our discussions and actions when shaping the future of the lands and water that the Zibi project is being constructed on. Indeed, in a paper that emphasized the uncertainty of property, it is fitting to suggest that this uncertainty should provide us with our starting point. As many have noted, the decolonial future is unknowable. While this uncertainty, this unknowability, can be a source of anxiety, as Eva Mackey suggests, uncertainty should be embraced, for it opens up the chance to have new conversations and new possibilities, to offer us new horizons. But at the same time, the future is somewhat certain. That is, it is the enduring sacredness of the land and the water that should act as our starting point when venturing into the unknown decolonial future. Indeed, it was the sacredness of this area and the stewardship and the sovereignty of the Anishinaabe people that provided my ancestors with the certainty that they were allowed to come here, to meet, to trade, and to hold their ceremonies. This was true for a lot of Indigenous nations that came here. And it can be the same way again. I suppose what I'm trying to suggest is that Anishinaabe sovereignty should not be feared. It should be embraced, and it should be the only certain thing moving forward.
Judy, you want to come on up? Thank you very much, Kanatase. I like the last presentation. I found that one. I was really impressed by your building on the Indigenous resurgent scholarship that's emerging. I really like the idea of thinking of property as a technology of settler colonialism, right? The logic of elimination, we know that it's aiming to eliminate Native people and replace us, but getting beyond that and looking at the specific avenues through which settler colonialism does that is a really important contribution. So I think thinking critically about private property is really helpful. So thank you again, Kanatase.
Sure. So I want to approach this question and answer very sensitive. I want to be sensitive because it is very controversial. I don't like the word controversial, but there are sort of competing understandings of the land. There are different land claims to the land. The Algonquins of Ontario, Zibi in Quebec, they're making claims to the same territory. And so I'm trying to stay clear of that as someone that's not Algonquin, that's not Anishinaabe. But at the same time, I want to be very clear that Anishinaabe sovereignty still exists. And so it's a matter of trying to work through that. And I think that what I'm trying to contribute to this is unsettling our understandings of property and claims to the Ottawa area. But to answer your question, it's arguably all across Canada. Every single space in Canada is unsettled. It's uncontested. Especially in British Columbia, though. The whole entire treaty process has been established. And so, and at the same, so you have a bunch of questions. And then the last question regarding the role of settlers or non-Algonquins, I think it's to be supportive. And there are groups that are supportive of the ongoing claim to the land. They would support the land claim of Ontario, the land claim of Quebec, and then there are also the architect like Douglas Cardinal supports he supports the vision of Elder William Commanda. And so there are these different approaches to this, and so it's a matter of trying to piece this together. And if anything, it's important to have the conversation. At least that's where I'm at right now, in this initial starting point. If that answers your question, or if you have more questions because of the way I answered.
The only thing I'd say is that the urgency of it,
yeah. Well, it's very urgent because it's ongoing. Like right now, they're developing. They're
hauling concrete out of that site right now.
Yeah.
So you go down there, and it's amazing how much activity there is.